If we talk about the legal components, just to walk folks through it, right? Typically, it's going to involve some sort of agreement, whether it's an asset purchase agreement or a purchase of interest in the entity if it's buying of interest in the business itself, and then especially if it's an external transaction, there's going to be elements of due diligence, right? Making sure that there's a good match, both from a strategic standpoint as well as thinking about, do our tech stacks match up? Are there any disciplinary issues that we should be aware of or complaints, or is there any litigation or red flags that we need to think about, right? So that's part of the process, once folks get further down the road.
Welcome, Model FAs. I am very excited to spend some time with our guest today, Richard Chen, who's the managing partner over at Richard Chen PLLC. Essentially, helps with everything that you need from a legal standpoint, ranging from starting your practice to compliance to cybersecurity and all things in between. So we're going to spend some time, actually a little bit of a different format today. So typically we'll start off with our guest's background and their story, head into what they do professionally, how they're serving advisors, head into their favorite book. And of course, one of my favorites is the after hours portion of the show. But we're going to flip this around a little bit. So what we're going to do is we're going to focus on Richard's profession and how he adds value to advisors, what advisors should be looking out for from a legal standpoint. So I got some questions prepared for Richard. Then we'll head into his favorite book, talk about that. And then we're going to get into his backstory. And I think, part of the reason why I want to wait for this is because Richard's backstory is phenomenal. And I think a lot of advisors, struggle with excuses throughout their business and throughout their life. And I think Richard's story is one that kind of gets rid of all your excuses, quite frankly, based on what he's been able to accomplish, especially with some of the things that he's dealt with in his life that could be interpreted as the perfect excuse to not do anything. But in reality, he's accomplished a lot and has overcome some of those things. So we're going to spend a lot of time on that. I think this is I think I can speak for this before we even get into the podcast, but this is going to be one of my favorite shows unpacking your story, Richard. So I appreciate your openness and willingness to be on the show. I appreciate Brad Wales, one of our prior guests, making an introduction to you, and very excited to learn more about your story. So Richard, thank you for joining the show.
Thanks for having me, David. It's great to be here.
Awesome. So you are in the legal space for our industry. So to give you some context about me specifically, because I want to ask some questions for people who may be in a similar seat as I was. So I come from the broker-dealer space where a lot of this stuff that you do was handled at the broker-dealer level. So I never really had experience with folks like you. When I went into consulting, I stopped being an advisor and therefore didn't open up an independent practice. So I'm somewhat new to your role as it relates to helping advisors kind of get into business on their own. So I'm going to ask some questions that would be relevant for those folks, as well as some questions around them transitioning. And once they do get to the point of pure independence, what are the things that they should be considering from a legal standpoint? So I guess my first question would be, Richard, when someone's considering making a transition from the broker-dealer space over to the independent space, there's a multitude of things that they need to consider, right? They need to consider, are they going out on their own or are they joining a larger firm? They're considering their tech stack. How are they going to deliver a great client experience and planning process? They're considering, names and logos and marketing and coaching and things like that. But specifically from a legal standpoint, what are things that advisors need to make sure that they're aware of during that transition, specifically as it relates to the legal component of that process?
That's a great question, David. And I think there's three general buckets of things that we want to consider. The first relates to what are the obligations that are owed to the advisor's current employer, because oftentimes advisors will be required to sign on to employment agreements that contain certain restrictions on what they can do once they leave. Non-solicitation of client and non-solicitation of employees is very common restrictions. And so it's important to understand what those restrictions are. Now, there are definitely obviously certain parameters around how advisors can leave depending on whether their firm is involved in, say, the broker protocol or whether or not. But it's important to understand what those restrictions are up front. The second thing to consider is the fact that there are oftentimes confidentiality obligations that are owed to the firm and preservation of those trade secrets. So important to understand what those are and what an advisor can and can't take with them. And the third thing is there are privacy considerations that relate to the advisor's clients as they are with the current employer, and because there are certain regulatory obligations that flow from the need to preserve that confidentiality. But it's important to take stock of all of those things and important to get some counsel in terms of how to navigate these transitions, because depending on where the advisor is coming from, it can require some coordination.
Cool. So let's walk through each of those in a little bit more depth. I'm going to go somewhat out of order. So the middle one first. So you mentioned something to the effect of trade secrets and, certain firms wanting to make sure that, you're not sharing those with others and things like that. Can you give me some examples of like what some of those trade secrets may be that advisors need to be mindful of?
Yeah, well, they can include, methods in terms of how a firm does its work, as well as even the list of clients or the way that the firm prospects for clients or things like that. Those can constitute trade secrets. Oftentimes, just the way in which a firm does things or even the documents that it has in place to work with the client can be protectable.
So I feel like my non-legal self, I feel like there's the potential of a lot of gray area with that point specifically. So let's say hypothetically, I learned a particular prospecting strategy, with the firm that I used to be with. Right. And perhaps that prospecting strategy, maybe they have, documents and PDFs and videos and things like that share with you how to actually execute that. So I think it's fairly obvious that like things like that, you can't, download them on your computer and keep them for yourself. However, if I've already learned, right, that strategy, it's tough to unlearn that. So am I expected to like not use what I've already learned that, may not be, truly proprietary, or what's the expectation there? Because I feel like, there's room for, some gray area and interpretation with that point.
Can get very complex very quickly, right? I mean, I think the first thing to understand is what are the actual obligations that are imposed in the confidentiality provisions in the various agreements that the advisor signs. But oftentimes, especially to the extent that they are more widely known, I think there's a relatively good way of thinking about this is that the more widely known, it seems to be there's less of a protectable interest. But again, the really important thing is to understand what are the parameters of the restrictions on disclosure and use, because they are both often covered in confidentiality provisions that advisors sign onto employment agreements, or they can be in policies and procedures that they agree to abide by. So they can find their way in a variety of circumstances. And I think this is where it's important to really talk with counsel and look through the specific types of scenarios in terms of what you're thinking about doing. Yeah, unfortunately, it is very facts and circumstances specific.
Gotcha. Now, specifically as it relates to the third point that you made, which is privacy, a quick yes or no question. I'm guessing that you're talking one of those line items could perhaps be client data, contact information, things like that. Is that accurate?
Yes. So there's a regulation called Regulation SP that governs financial firms that protects that data, and especially from including with respect to folks who are leaving the firm. So there need to be certain protections in place with respect to making sure that clients is not being misappropriated by a departing advisor. Now, oftentimes, because these transitions are coordinated, part of the coordination is making sure that, those privacy laws are not violated.
I think the juiciest point that you made, which is, with the transition, non-solicit agreements, as you mentioned. So let's say I'm an advisor, I have $100 million in assets under management, and I have some sort of non-solicit agreement, with the firm that I was with prior that in writing prevents me from, bringing over those clients, right? Or, some firms, I don't know if they also include like non-competes where they expect you, if you leave, to do something totally different in a different industry. But I've heard a lot of like conflicting stories in the past. So I've heard things like, yeah, there's non-solicit, but there's, ways around it, and they don't really, hold up per se, if it were to go to court. I've heard things like, nope, I literally am not allowed to do so and I'll get sued. I've heard of companies, using some scare tactics with, a bunch of legal paperwork, when they leave, kind of scare tactics, if you will. So if I'm someone who has $100 million in assets and I want to transition, how do I make a living if I have a non-solicit? Is there a way to still transition clients without potentially, getting sued, by that prior firm? What are you seeing in the industry?
Yeah, so that's a great question. And fortunately, the answer is it really depends. And it's very facts and circumstances specific. So, and there's a couple of things to think about. First is that the laws that apply with respect to an agreement oftentimes are spelled out in the agreement. And they are often state specific. So states have different parameters as to, the enforceability of provisions, right, related to non-competition and non-solicitation of clients and employees. And so oftentimes it does require an analysis of the state-specific laws and what's a court likely to do in those circumstances. So, sometimes those provisions may be considered overly broad. Sometimes there are certain states like California where non-competition, non-solicitation provisions have been seen as in less favorable light in terms of enforceability, but it really is state specific. But there is also another consideration, which is whether or not the firm that the advisor is departing from is part of what's called the broker protocol, which it's a reciprocal agreement whereby the parties who are, signatories to the protocol have agreed to facilitate transition because, sometimes they are on the receiving end of advisors who are coming and sometimes they're on the departing side where the advisors are leaving. And so instead of going back and forth, constant litigation with respect to these restrictive covenants, the parties who agreed to be signatories to the protocol agree that, the advisor can, under certain specified conditions, take basic information related to the client, including contact information, but definitely much more detailed information they're not supposed to take relating to the client's files, right? So that is designed to facilitate transition, and that can definitely make it much more palatable and easier for an advisor to leave a firm that is a signatory to the protocol. If the advisor's not, it definitely involves much more detailed understanding of what the restrictions are in the agreement and, looking at the state laws and sort of how the states have interpreted similar types of provisions in the past.
Now, is my understanding correct that when you leave, if a client reaches out to you directly and says, I want to still work with you, that circumvents any sort of non-solicit that was in place if the client is the one making that request? Or am I thinking about that wrong?
No. Just because a client reaches out to you directly does not mean that you will not have violated the provision. It can still potentially be seen as a violation of the restriction.
So in theory, there could be situations to where, someone's transition is a non-issue and they bring their $100 million, with them, depending on the contract that they signed. There could be a scenario to where if clients call them, that's okay. Some situations that may not be okay. And then in the worst case scenario, have you seen, within your time practicing and working with the financial services industry, have you ever seen, someone with a good sized book of business, call it, $100 million, to where they're literally starting from scratch if they go out on their own? Or is that not typically the case?
It's definitely possible depending on what happens, but usually it's not the case. And so, yeah, but it is a possibility.
Okay, cool. So let's go to the other end of the spectrum. So we were just talking about how, if someone's transitioning from a larger organization to opening up shop on their own, things that they should be considering as it relates to, privacy, trade secrets, and, non-solicit, non-compete sort of scenarios. And I feel like you did a good job unpacking that. And unfortunately, one of my biggest frustrations is always hearing the "it depends" answer. And obviously I know every situation's different. And I think it just kind of, highlights the importance of seeking counsel before you even take that should be the first step before you're thinking about your logo or, any of those things. Because if you're, stuck in a pretty tight scenario, you want to know that before you actually make that transition. So I think it, exemplifies the fact that you got to seek counsel before you're making this transition. Because I know for me, when I started at my firm, I was 20 years old. I was signing contracts without even reading it. So looking back, it was definitely something that I should not have done and should have, read those contracts before. But, I was just excited about my, first legit job. So, seeking counsel, I think, is of the utmost importance before you even begin to consider, the other aspects of a transition like tech stack, marketing, things like that. So going on the other end of the spectrum, let's say you're an advisor, you got a $500 million book of business, whatever the size is, it doesn't really matter. And I say, hey, I'm in my 60s. I've had enough. I want to ride into the sunset and I want to sell my business. I either want to sell that to just any buyer out there who wants it, or perhaps, sell it internally to the advisors or employees on my team. So what I'm talking about here, of course, is succession planning. So I know that you have a big focus on that within your practice. So similar question, before I even consider the other components of a succession plan from a legal perspective, what are things that should be on my radar throughout my decision-making process?
So I think oftentimes succession is not so much driven by legal consideration. I think what's really important in my experience seeing what advisors are looking for is to really understand the goals, right? And that's ultimately what matters to advisors, right? Is it monetization? Is it trying to, and they can often be, many goals, right? Making sure your clients are taken care of. How about the employees? Do you want it to be an internal succession, or do you feel like it's better to have someone come in to take over the practice and perhaps grow it, right? It's important to understand what is important to you as an advisor. The good part is that there are so many options out there, right? In terms of firms that are willing to take on, in terms of succession, there are tons of financing strategies to make things happen, to facilitate those transactions. But ultimately, the first thing is what's important to the advisor.
Understood. So it's more so, from my understanding of what you just said, it's more so like a strategic sort of conversation, more so than it is a legal conversation. And where the legal component comes in is the actual manufacturing of the deal once they identify the type of deal that they're looking for.
Yeah. Well, so if we talk about the legal components, just to walk folks through it, right? Typically, it's going to involve some sort of agreement, whether it's an asset purchase agreement or a purchase of interest in the entity of its buying of interest in the business itself, and then especially if it's an external transaction, there's going to be elements of due diligence, right? Making sure that there's a good match, both from a strategic standpoint, as well as thinking about, do our tech stacks match up? Are there any disciplinary issues that we should be aware of, or complaints, or is there any litigation or red flags that we need to think about, right? So that's part of the process, once folks get further down the road, and then ultimately, one of the things at the end oftentimes is, especially if an advisor is handing off clients to another advisor, is provisions relating to whether or not those client agreements, how they can be assigned over to the new advisor, if that's in fact what's going to happen. And typically that requires a bit of a choreographing of how those assignments would take place, depending on whether the clients have to affirmatively or negatively consent, or whether they can just consent by, non-responsiveness. That does take time, right? So those are some of the legal consideration.
Okay. And then I'm sure the answer to my next question is going to be, it depends, but I will, I'm going to ask it anyways, because I want to get a sense of as to what you typically see the majority of the time. So if I'm looking to transition, are you seeing that folks who transition tend to do so like, once they make the decision, they sell it and they're out, they wipe, their hands clean and ride into the distance? Or, do you find that, they try and, transition those clients over, perhaps a 1, 2, or 3 year period, get them comfortable with that, advisor who's buying the book, and, perhaps stay on board, with a retainer for a period of time, to help with some of those things? Like, what do you find is most typical, with the transitions themselves?
Yeah, so more often than not, I find that, it's both in the seller's and the buyer's interest to have the seller involved in the transition process for a period of time. And sometimes the economics are built in that way, right? If there are earnouts or price adjustments based on how many clients are transitioned over, typically a buyer will want to make sure that the bulk of the clients move over to the new firm and that they're able to maintain those assets on their platform. So oftentimes you'll see selling advisors becoming an employee or contractor for the buying advisor for a period of time before they transition off and do, whatever else they do once they leave the firm.
Well, awesome. I think that's super helpful for those two categories of folks. I guess the theme would be transitions. Are you transitioning into independence, or are you transitioning, towards, the sunset, so to speak, and getting out of the business and empowering someone else, in line. So I think, that was super helpful. I do want to transition slightly to your favorite book, which I also happened to read as well a little while ago. So as a reminder to everyone listening, really, I want to promote learning in our industry, both in our industry, but also outside of our industry, because I feel as if there's so many good nuggets in other industries and through other people's stories that we can then take and apply to our industry here. So the book that you had made a note of, Richard, is The E-Myth, or I think specifically The E-Myth Revisited. So if that's the actual title, I think I read The E-Myth, but if there's a second book to it or a revision, I have not read that. But tell us a little bit about The E-Myth and why it was impactful for you specifically.
I really identify with a lot of my clients as advisors because we're all entrepreneurs at the end of the day. The question is, whether or not we all understand what that means when we go in. And this book was very helpful because, at least for lawyers, oftentimes they start their practice because they want to work for themselves. But ultimately, they believe that just being a good lawyer will help them succeed. And that's nothing could be further from the truth. But there are so many other elements to being a good entrepreneur, right? And it's important to understand that it's important to work on the business as well as in it, because frankly, if you just work in it, it's just another job, right? And you're beholden to all the other things which can sneak up on you over time if you don't understand what else is involved in operating the business. For instance, taking care of the financial controls and operations and marketing, human resources, all of these things are important. And so, as an entrepreneur, it's important to understand how to make sure that all these things get taken care of without becoming overwhelming. And this is where the E-Myth says that it's important to understand how to put in place systems whereby you can bring on people, right, and have them run the parts of the business that you delegate for them to run while allowing you to focus on what you really want to focus on in the business, right? Whether that's being the practitioner advisor or whether you want to be focusing on business development or whatever. But, what this book really opened my eyes to is the need to understand all these roles. And as a matter of fact, it said, one of the good exercises is to write down a job description for each of the roles that you would think you need to fulfill and then sign a contract, right? Initially, we have to take care of all this stuff. Question is, how do we get a lot of these tasks out of our hands and into someone else's hands? And the important thing is to build in processes, right? So that someone else can take care of these things in a very systematic way without, micromanaging. And that will make, I think, being an entrepreneur a lot more pleasant. I mean, initially, so I've just celebrated my second anniversary, right, of my firm. It's a process. It takes a lot of time and it's an ongoing effort, right? But I think about it in terms of not only enjoyment, hopefully down the road, but productivity, efficiency, and risk mitigation, right? All these things can happen if we think about all the functions that need to take place and put systems in place to make sure that they happen.
Hey, Model FAs. I know you're enjoying this conversation, but I wanted to take a quick break to talk to you about the Model FA Accelerator. This is a unique collaboration between us and you, where we help you build a financial advising practice that you can be proud of. We focus on the foundational concepts around how to pick a niche or a specialization, how to price your services, how to construct an offer that people are going to buy, and then how to market it and sell it in a way that'll get people to sign on the dotted line and become clients of your firm, all while giving you the information to scale and set up workflows and operational processes that will allow you to reclaim your time and build a practice that doesn't run you. So if you'd like to hear more about that, go to www.modelfa.com/accelerator or www.modelfa.com. Hover over Work With Us and click on Accelerator. Hope to see you in the program.
I believe in that too. You mentioned something about where, that entrepreneur or other folks on the team should be spending their time. And we believe that, folks should be doing things that gives them energy, quite frankly. So we have something called an energy audit that we bring our clients through, which is, ranges from your zone of genius to your zone of incompetence. So things that you're great at and you love doing, things that, you're good at and you like doing, things that you're good at but you don't like doing, and things that you don't like doing and you're not good at. And spending the majority of your time, if not ideally all of your time, in that top left quadrant of your zone of genius, and then empowering other people in your organization or utilizing technology to empower you to delegate, automate, or quite frankly, delete some of the stuff that's on your plate that may not be relevant. So for those of you who are listening, if you think that energy audit may be helpful for you and your business, if you haven't gone through an exercise like that before, go ahead and shoot me an email at david@modelfa.com. And in the subject line, just say energy audit. And I'll go ahead and I'll reply with that PDF that you can fill out. And as an additional thank you for reaching out, I'll spend some time with you on the phone to debrief that and give you some insight as to how you can go about delegating, automating, or deleting some of the things that were in the other three quadrants. So I did listen to that book, some similar takeaways as you, and I'm glad that you spent a few minutes sharing that.
Yeah. I agree with you completely. I think deleting tasks is really critical because, there's way more than we can accomplish on our plates typically. And just really knocking out the things that are unnecessary is so helpful.
For sure. And it's not, we'll say too, that it's not just deleting. I guess there's a fourth one if I think about delegating, deleting, or automating, which is postponing. Mm-hmm. So oftentimes we have a never-ending list of things that we need to do, and it can be overwhelming. Oftentimes we keep those things in our head, so it occupies our mind. And if we can just get them down on paper or a digital list or something like that, that'll help, give you a breath of fresh air. But also, I would imagine most things on that list, if not everything on that list, is important. Some things, however, just may not be urgent, right? So if you can status things appropriately that say, hey, I'm going to accomplish this in Q4 later this year, or this is a 2022 play as opposed to a current year play, and just statusing them appropriately, it can help reduce the noise in your mind by writing it down and statusing it, and help you kind of realign your focus to the things that are actually urgent that will move the needle faster for you than some of those outstanding projects that tend to just always stay on your list. So just postponing them, kicking them down the road. And then, of course, once you get there, following through with that plan that you have to, do that in Q4 in that example. So yeah, I agree with you a lot. So Richard, I want to get into a little bit about your backstory. I want to kind of tee it up, before doing so. So for everyone listening, I'm really excited about this because I feel like most everyone I work with, quite frankly, including myself too, it's easy to make excuses as to why we're not doing what we should be doing or what we potentially could be doing. Ranges from, I'm busy with my family, or I'm busy with meetings, or, physically I'm unable to do that, or, I'm depressed about this, or I'm anxious about that. And although I think it's important to share what some of those excuses are, to vent a little bit, at the end of the day, they're excuses, right? And they're holding us back from living our true potential. So I try and focus a lot on my coaching calls and through content, helping people push through those limiting beliefs. So Richard, you are an entrepreneur, have your own business, you have a beautiful family, you went to Harvard for your undergrad, you went to Harvard for your JD. I'll go as far as to say against all odds, because one thing that we have not mentioned yet is the fact that you've done all this and have built a successful business and have served your clients and have been able to raise a family and have been able to graduate from one of the most pristine universities in the country, all while being blind.
That's right.
So if anyone has an excuse, Richard, it is you, and you've accomplished more than the majority of people out there who can see. So what I'd like you to talk about, I guess, first question, and this is more of a reminder for me as well as some context for the audience. Were you born blind, or is it something that happened at a different stage in your life, just so we have have kind of a starting point of that?
So I was born with almost no sight. So I had extremely, extremely limited sight, could see large objects. I still bumped into things when I was a kid, but it was a very, very limited sight. And I used machines to read with that would blow up print like 20 times. So that might give an idea of sort of my limitation in terms of sight. About 10 years ago, I started noticing that the limited sight I had was deteriorating. So probably in the last 3 years, I lost the rest of the sight. And that was a challenge as well. But, it's also the time when I started the practice, right after that.
So how did you, so I just think about myself in that scenario. And I feel like a lot of people would, potentially have the woe is me mentality and, that's it. Not going to be able to accomplish much. And you've done the total opposite. So I'm going to keep this question open-ended and I'll ask some more specific questions as we go along. But where do you find your motivation to keep going and to accomplish great things when everyone would understand and empathize with your excuse if you decided to use that card? Where do you get your motivation from, even from the early stages at Harvard, all the way to, your current business now?
Yeah, it's a great question. So I think of it probably in 3 phases, right? One is when I was a very young child, my parents always encouraged and pushed us to, and my brother's actually completely blind too. So, they pushed us to learn and without excuses, right? They expected the same of us. As a matter of fact, perhaps more than other people. I was taking piano lessons at 3. So, as early as 5, my parents were like, you'll be an attorney. So I think initially it was, you just want to please your parents, right? But then as I went through school, you started experiencing resistance and certain, forms of, I'll call it inadvertent discrimination, where people didn't have the same expectations, didn't give you the same opportunities, or didn't give us the same opportunities. And so at that point, it kind of became a matter of proving to people that I could do it. And in the course of doing that, I think I also realized that I enjoy a lot of things, right? I enjoy learning. I enjoy music. I enjoy languages. Later on, I enjoyed traveling. And so that fueled me. I think that fueled me a long time until early in my career, well past Harvard and Harvard Law School. And then I started at working at a number of large multinational law firms in New York. And I think during that early period, I think I was still trying to prove it to myself as well as others that you could do it. At some point, though, I think it stopped. You got older and realized, the real key is that motivates is the desire to make an impact on my family, my church, my clients, and just whoever I can to motivate and encourage them, right? And that takes different forms in terms of what I do. But I really, really enjoy that because I feel like it helps to encourage people now to see that they can accomplish great things. And also just not to believe the doubters, right? I mean, we as entrepreneurs know that there are plenty of doubters out there, right? So, and I have kind of adopted a mentality over time that thinking about what others think of me is really not that important to me.
So what are some of the things, Richard, that you have to do, I guess, in business and in life that someone else wouldn't even have to consider doing just to get around and run the business? So as an example, I email you and you email me back right away. Is it dictated to you and you dictate back? Do you have an associate that's helping? And just kind of walking around life. I want to give our listeners a sense of some of the things that you are required to go through on a daily basis just to live that normal life, so that they can see that they don't have to worry about that. And if you can accomplish what you've accomplished, what the heck is holding them back? Right. So what are some of those things that someone like me wouldn't even have to consider thinking about that you need to do on a daily basis just to be able to manage your life and your business?
Yeah, so it's a great question. This is where, I've advocated technology, not only from a basic functioning perspective for my sake, but, just in terms of the productivity gains that it can give a lot of folks over time. When I was in high school and college, the technology wasn't nearly as good as it is today. But in my practice, you said large amount of it is done online. And I have software built into my computer. It's called text to speech software. And so basically what it'll do is it'll replicate written text into a spoken word so you can hear it. And let me see if I can play it for you a little bit so you can hear it. You might be able to hear in the background a little. So that's my computer talking to me, right? So it'll tell me what I am reading. It'll tell me what I'm typing. And that helps a lot. So I can do my emails. I can draft my documents and my agreements. I can do my legal research and things like that. So, and it's huge. My practice is in the cloud, which is great now. So, but there are challenges still, right? Hard copy documents, which, sometimes I have to use certain types of technology to convert them into optical character recognition so I can scan it in and read it. And there's still inaccessible websites out there where, no matter what my text-to-speech output software says, it still can't read it. So it's a constant game of cat and mouse. But, I think that what I've realized over time is, the key is not to dwell in frustration, but to try to solve problems, and that's what I try to do for my clients, right? I give legal advice, but ultimately I see myself as a problem solver for people.
So it sounds like, I really like what you said at the end. I feel like most people are really good at finding problems and either complaining about them and not doing anything about it, or just using that as, their excuse as to why they're not where they want to be. And what you're saying is, no. Identify the problem, but freaking do something about it, right? And make sure that you're doing everything in your power and leveraging, tools that are out there to be able to help facilitate a normal way of life, regardless of, your circumstances. I could be wrong, Richard, I will say, so I don't want this to be too assumptive, but I would imagine that you're a normal person like the rest of us, specifically as it relates to having good days and bad days. I'd be shocked if, every single day that you've had, especially with some of the challenges that you've experienced, that you've been, happy-go-lucky 100% of the time. So what I'd like you to talk about, if you don't mind, is like, what have been some of the darkest moments that you've had, and specifically, how did it affect you, and how'd you get out of that? How'd you reframe your mindset to have a more positive perspective when you were in some of those challenging times? Yeah,
so that's a great question. And so I think, it definitely had a lot of challenges when the rest of my site started to disappear. I mean, as limited as my site was before, it was still usable site, right? And the fact of being older in my 40s and trying to figure out new ways of doing things, frankly, realizing that there's certain things I can't experience now that I used to, right? Which is hard. But I think, over time, I do believe a big portion of it is my faith. I believe in God, and I believe that there's a plan for me. And that plan is to continue to make an impact for people. And, yes, it happened. And it's hard because, when you have to let go of certain things that you enjoy, it's hard, right? I love sports, so I can't watch games on TV anymore, right? So, but, there's so many things I can do. Right. And so it's really a matter, part of it was, just making sure that I could continue to do what I had to do and to adapt to new ways of doing things. And part of it is taking it step by step, right? You can't eat an elephant all at once, right? And
one bite at a time.
One bite at a time. It really does help, because I think it's so daunting sometimes to think, where and how we'll would be when if we just try to do things one step at a time, consult other people, who have basic things and succeeded, do research, figure out ways to solve problems, right? I think it's helpful, but it's daunting if we think of it as just like a huge mountain to move. And so it is a process, because I don't think about those things nearly as much as I used to, partly because I'm busy, but because I really do enjoy where I am now and, the ability to impact others and then encourage others.
That's awesome. I'm hearing kind of three main themes with that I want to articulate to everyone listening. So number one, I heard that it's helpful if you, the listener, and you, Richard, and me, myself, is constantly focused on that higher purpose, right? Why are we here? What type of impact are we looking to have? Because that makes whatever we're going through tiny compared to, what we're called to do. So having that higher purpose would be number one. Number two is oftentimes people focus on what they can't do. And you're saying, well, no. Like if you do that, you're going to be miserable. So you might as well focus on what you can do, right? And having that positive outlook. And then to kind of wrap that all up, it's, don't try and tackle everything at once. Just take one step at a time, right? The elephant example, one bite at a time, and just take that baby step forward and just make sure that you're maintaining momentum and you're not stopping, because if you stop, it's probably because you're focusing on the negative stuff, the I can'ts in your life as opposed to the I cans. And you're certainly not living your higher purpose, if you're not moving forward. So all those three things combined, put a bow on it, I feel like is great advice. And again, I think I'd be hard pressed to believe that there's folks that have, better quote unquote excuses than you could certainly use. And those three things, higher purpose, positive mindset, and one step at a time, is applicable to anyone, regardless of their circumstances.
You said it better than me.
Oh, well, I appreciate that. I think it's impressive what you've built. I do want to, hear some more stories. I'm sure, we've talked about, some of the rewarding stories and things that you've overcome, but imagine with being blind, you got some funny stories, as well. So I definitely want to ask you some of those questions, in our after hours portion. But before we do so, Richard, if people want to hear more about your story, more about your services, if they're thinking about a transition, if they're thinking about a succession, if they're thinking about compliance, if they're thinking about cybersecurity, or any other component of their business that requires, some general counsel, where can they find you?
Yeah, absolutely. Always can email me at richardlchen.com. We also have a website if you're more interested in the services, www.richardlchen.com, or connect with me on LinkedIn. I just enjoy talking with people, right? Whether they're our clients or not. I figure, whoever wants to reach out to me, if I can be an encouragement to you or I can be helpful to you, I enjoy doing that.
Awesome. And I will say too, on both Richard's website and on his LinkedIn, he has a fantastic video about his story. Whoever you had for a videographer and person who edited it did a fantastic job. So I think that does a great job of capturing your story, capturing, what you're passionate about, and capturing how you can, serve other folks and really what's important to you. So, feel free to go take a look at that. And actually, our show notes company is listening to this recording right now. So I'll ask them to go to Richard's website, or his LinkedIn, and pull that video down and include that link in the show notes as well. That way, you guys have easy access to that while you're listening to the podcast. But, with that being said, we appreciate everyone's time. We're going to head into the after hours portion here in a second. We get some laughs in there. And then also, if you would be so kind as to share this episode with someone that that either may be in some sort of transitional moment in their life where there's, legal counsel involved, or perhaps someone who you're sick of hearing their excuses and you want to say, hey, listen to what this guy did, focus on your higher purpose, focus on the positive stuff, and take a baby step in the right direction. Feel free to share that. I'd really appreciate that. And I'm sure Richard would, as well. And then on top of that, if you would be so kind as to leave a review for us on iTunes, that will help certainly, with our listenership and increasing the amount of folks that get access to the podcast. And if you do so, just simply screenshot that review, shoot me a text, 978-228-2338. You'll get an automated reply that will have you put in your, name and information, just so you're added to my contacts. And then beyond that, you're going to be texting with me. It's just the initial kind of upfront, portion of it is automated. And if you send that and just do so with, Richard Chen, the name included as well, that way I know what episode it is. And like I said, would appreciate that. And we'll also give you access to some referral methodology within our digital course that can help you get some more referrals for your business. So I'd imagine everyone listening to this would love to continue to grow their business. So this would be a great resource for you. So go ahead and shoot me that text message with that review, and I'll give you access to that right away. So with that, Richard, I appreciate your time, and we are going to head into the after hours portion. That was really cool, man. I appreciate obviously the professional aspect, but also utilizing your story, quite frankly, to empower others and, remind them that your purpose is of the utmost importance, your mindset is of the utmost importance, and just taking steps in the right direction is important regardless of what you're going through. It could be someone like you who's blind. It can be someone who just lost a family member. It could be someone going through, a divorce like I did a few years back. It could really be anything. And I think those three principles, purpose, positivity, and, moving in the right direction, is applicable to any one of those scenarios. So I really appreciate you being open to, talking and sharing your story.
Absolutely. Oh, my pleasure. I love doing it. And, we could all use more encouragement. I mean, it's crazy because, we need more positivity. It seems like so many things and commentaries are negative these days. I think we all need positive encouragement. So
for sure. So you mentioned that you have a brother who's also blind.
Yes.
Any other siblings or just you two?
Just us two. Yeah.
Cool. So growing up, what was that like? Your parents must have had their hands full.
I think it was really challenging. They sacrificed a lot. They had to move from a successful job in a restaurant that they owned in New Orleans to move to Houston when my brother and I were entering kindergarten so that we could find schooling that would be able to take care of our needs at the time. Because, back then, this is the early 80s, there wasn't much in the way of mainstreaming for folks with disabilities into classrooms. And so there were some schools, particularly in Houston, that were particularly helpful. And so they sacrificed a lot. And I think that really set an example for me too, in terms of how, I live life. But it was a challenge. There's a lot of hard points because, it looks great now, but it comes with a lot of heartache, when you realize that, and frustrations, things, don't always go the way that you expect. So
what's a lesson or two from your folks that you learned early on that has not just stuck with you, but also that you've shared with your kids as well? Because you have what, 2 kids, 3 kids?
2 kids. Yeah. I've got 2 kids, a 4-year-old daughter and a 2-year-old son. Yeah.
Awesome. So what are some of the lessons that you've held on to from your folks that you've either already or plan to pass down to your kids as well? Yeah.
So my parents were immigrants from Taiwan, came over in search of a better life. And so, they worked very hard, and oftentimes my brother and I were left at home because they were both working out, when we would come home from school. So they had to work very hard. And that really did stick with me. You realize how critical it is to put whatever you have into making sure. And, that really meant a lot to me. And then the other thing, which I mentioned before, is high expectations. So hopefully they'll appreciate this at some point. But, like my parents, we want our kids to explore and to know that, we have high expectations of them. We don't want to push them in areas that they don't want to go in, but we want to give them exposure to a lot of things. And if they pick something, we expect them to be the best at it that they can be, right? And I think a lot of that is part of our role as parents, just encourage them and to make sure to not give them excuses for, not doing better when we know they can.
Awesome. Now, I picture, or I would imagine, I should say, could be wrong, but I imagine that, going through your life the way that you've, I think, have been gifted to go through life, because I would imagine that you have a different, outlook and perspective than most people. And I would imagine that you've really practiced gratitude, throughout your life. Again, things that can do, as opposed to focusing on things that you can't do. But I would imagine that you need to sprinkle in a sense of humor along the way as well. So I'm curious to know whether it was a kid or recently or somewhere in between. What's the funniest story that you have, going through your life that's, related to you being blind? And, did you laugh about it at the time, or was it more of a reflective laugh, when you thought back to it?
It's a good question. I do agree the sense of humor is important. And I'm one of the folks, and I understand different people are different in terms of their sensitivity with respect to it. I'm always quite open about this, and I encourage conversation about it. No, in terms of funny stuff, friends. Oh, I guess there is one story where my friends in high school insisted that I learn to drive. So they put me in a car. They put me in a car in a parking lot. And so they were insisting that I drive. So that was pretty fun, you know, and
how'd it go?
It went about as well as you could expect. It was fine. Let's just say that it's good that there was a lot of space. So
that's funny.
Yeah.
Well, I view your friends in high school being supportive, but also, you know, making sure that they were getting a chuckle out of it as well, but also, you know, being inclusive and, you know, at least giving you that experience nonetheless. But
they're great friends. Yeah. And it's amazing. Boy, you go over time and you realize you've known these folks for so long, and it's just a blessing to have those, you know, relationships.
Awesome, man. Well, Richard, I really appreciate it. For those of you who stuck around for the after hours portion, hopefully, you know, learned a lesson or two from, you know, Richard's folks as it relates to hard work and sacrifice. I got a chuckle out of the driving story. So hopefully you did as well. I would have loved to be a fly in the car, you know, during that experience. So I could also fly off, you know, in case I had to, you know, but appreciate you spending some time. Very much impressed with your story. Grateful that, you know, you got to share it with me and the folks who are listening, and glad to have you in our industry as well. So, you know, with that, Richard, I appreciate it, and looking forward to chatting soon and see how we may be able to elevate one another moving forward.
I'm looking forward to it, David. Thanks again for having me. It's been great.
Awesome.